less focused on literature, but more to give us an image of Mexico. We've talked a lot, especially yesterday, about identity, about writers writing in a certain language but living in another country, and about displacement, about borders in a sense. And I'd like to throw a quote at you from that I heard. It was an artist talking to what he called an African artist, who told him, if your modern art is our traditional art, does that make our contemporary art your cliché? So I'll repeat it again, because I thought it was quite important the first time I heard it, but a little bit heavy. If your modern art is our traditional art, does that make our contemporary art your cliché? And I just wanted to know, how does that relate to your art, the art of writing?
Well, I would say, hi, I would say hello first. Thank you for being here. I think that one of the challenges as a Mexican writer living in the United States, but that would extend to being a Mexican writer in the world more generally, is confronting the prejudice around and the ignorance around Mexican and Mexicanness. And indeed, what has traveled as Mexican throughout the world is usually a very cliched form of traditional or folk art, right? What people associate with Mexico in terms of its, not popular culture, because popular culture has extended into telenovelas and other mass media forms, but when people think even just of highbrow or elite Mexican culture, the associations are usually those of the early 20th century muralists, Frida Kahlo, a series of icons that became internationalized, not so much in the 20s, but much later on, and that have become iconic of Mexican cultural production. And they are all wrapped in some kind of exotism and folklorization. And so as a Mexican in the United States or outside in the world, it's hard to not end up representing Mexicanness or end up being expected to embody some form of recognizable Mexican identity. So I think my work is not at all linked to that form of Mexicanness. So it is indeed very Mexican. In my work, I criticize or satirize the Mexican upper classes, for example, or I try to confront popular culture with highbrow culture, but it's not a definite or a definitely Mexican. So, for example, something that happened to me with my first novel, when it had been translated into English and had been published in the UK, and then was circulating among American editors. What I got back as a response, many times, these were emails sent to me by my agent that she had received from American editors. And some of these responses said things like, "Oh no, this novel is too European," as if I don't know, as if it were maybe expected of me, being Mexican in the USA, to write about drug wars or about border problems or embody some kind of preconceived notion of Mexicanness.
Can I just follow up a little bit on that? Did you ever have a chance to talk to any editors, either in the UK or the US, about what they might have expected?
You usually don't appeal a rejection note. So these emails were, no, we're not going to publish it all because it's not Mexican enough, and so we don't know where to place it. You know. So I usually don't write back to email.
So, I don't know if it's necessary.
Yes, yes.
I feel like in Eurovisión, get one of these ones. I sound in Russian, yes, and dance. I dance very well, as all Latinos. No, I really don't know. I think that cultures dress up themselves to sell themselves as a successful product, and then they have to pay for the consequences of that dressing up, of that cross-dressing. So this, Valeria was speaking about the 30s and 40s and the radicalization of the Mexican culture, and well, that was a cultural policy designed by the Mexican state in a very rational way to occupy the space that the United States was leaving alone during the Second World War. So Mexico marketed itself as a nation that has been a subject during the many centuries of the Mexican culture as a culture with a classical past. In the Americas, we are the culture with the classical past. You know, the Americans may have money, the Argentinians may always take us out of the World Cup, but we have a classical past. We have the Tehuacan, we have the Mayas, we have this. So that kind of folkloric thing that like we are the Greeks of the America, or we of the Americas, or we are the Romans of the Americas, stayed there. You know, and it was designed in an office, and that's how it was. In the later years, Mexico has been trying to sell itself as a globalized space, as the nation where the cultures cross. You know, it was the way to China in the 16th century. It's the connection between the Anglo-speaking Americas and the Spanish-speaking Americas, etc. It is a nation that speaks an European language that is not English. All of those ideas. I think that the problem with those things is that they are somehow true. You know, but that doesn't have anything to do with your real work. As a writer, I work with all the culture I have, and all the dictionary I have, and all the grammar I have. I certainly don't feel that I'm playing with the green T-shirt of the Mexican team when I am writing, to respond with the standard response of the Afro-American artist is I am an artist, not an Afro-American artist. Now, if I will cash looking like Frida Kahlo, I will be happy to dress myself as a China. That's so that you have to live with those things, but I don't think that they really matter. Nothing that we do maybe if you do pop music, if you do movies, you reach different audiences, and you have to worry about those messages more. No? Literature is a very quiet thing. It's something you do in your studio, and people read in their studio. So those etiquettes, if they work for selling something, it's fine. If they don't, it really doesn't molest me at all.
Just a little bit as overall, do you feel that this, you said it doesn't molest you at all? Do you think that that would have been the case even if, would it be different if you were not living in the United States in New York City? Or did the projection of your identity change because of that move?
I mean,
I don't remember my life before leaving. No, it's not that I don't remember it, but I moved to the US in the 90s. I returned to Mexico for a period, but my adult life has happened more in the United States with the poverty of my English shows my lack of talent for foreign languages. No? But
I disagree with that.
I don't know. I really don't know. Maybe I would be more anxious about showing off as a cosmopolitan character. And being a Mexican from the US, I'm more action. My anxiety goes the other way around. The Mexicans of the US are much more Mexican than the real Mexicans. So there is this real and non-real category. There is 15 million Mexicans living in the US, and they are certainly much more noisy about their Mexicanity than the Mexicans living in Mexico. Now, I come and go. I am not a Latino. I wish I was.
Maybe you can explain a little bit. I'm not sure how many in the audience know. What does it mean when you say I'm not a Latino?
Well, I mean, there's many, it's a broad definition. And so Latin Americans is everyone born from the Rio Bravo, which is the frontier with the United States, and also Patagonia, would define themselves as a Latin American, regardless of the language they speak. The Caribbean sometimes defines itself in terms of Latin America, but often also separates itself geographically by circumscribing only to the Caribbean. So a Latin American in the USA is not necessarily a Latino, and I think we both, I don't want to speak for both of us, but I think that we both, when we arrived in New York some years ago, would have defined ourselves as Latin Americans in the USA and not Latinos. Latinos, from my perspective, from a more generalized perspective also, would be migrants that have been there for a long time, that have somehow that somehow now belong to general demographics of the USA. And I was very careful at the beginning to not belong to that demographic simply because I felt that I was not entitled to it, and also because there was a certain pride with respect to writing in Spanish, for example, and now I've betrayed a lot of those things. Now I'm writing more in English. I think I am slowly becoming Latino, inevitably. Our daughter we're married, by the way, is a Latino, very much so. She speaks in a very strange mixture of English and Spanish. She brings in the culture of the United States into our dining room table, so to speak. And I think that at least one of my resistances, Alvaro says that he may have become more Mexican in the USA. I had a strange mirror game in the USA, but I considered myself Mexican mestizo, which means basically a mixture of Spanish with some indigenous Mexican blood, but was not ever very conscious of my skin color while in Mexico, or it's complicated, we can go there later. But when I arrived in the USA, I was constantly being invited to write for spaces in magazines or newspapers as, quote unquote, a woman of color. And I think, what do they mean with color? And I told one friend of mine, a black friend of mine, they're calling me a woman of color. Do they think I'm black, or like, what do I respond to this? And he laughed at me and said, of course you're not white. But of course you're not white. And it was this really strange realization for me to realize that I am not considered white in the USA. And at first I had a sense of rejection to that idea. And now I after living there amongst WASPs and so on and so forth, I very much embrace the fact that I am a woman of color and not a white.
Well, no, I think it's interesting what she said. She sort of said she didn't want to talk for you, but you said talking about maybe embracing a little bit more and becoming more of that Latina, whereas you would become more Mexican. Why and how? I mean, I guess it's a little surprising given what you just said, so if you would elaborate on it, I think it would be...
Yeah. No, I just don't feel entitled to use the Latino category. That's all. No? One of the most moving and interesting things that are going on in contemporary United States is this movement of the illegal populations that arrive at what is called the dreamers, that are the kids that arrive or in the mother's tummies, or that were not born in the US, but were raised American, but they don't have papers, and they are having they are producing a really interesting new way of being American, and I don't feel entitled to that. I leave that to my children that are American, that grow up watching American television, and that I respect that movement, but I understand that I belong to the older guard. No? I see myself as a migrant, not as a Latino. No? I'm a producer of Latinos, which is a very elegant position. Yes, I don't have to form part of it. I don't have to be part of a discussion in which I really don't have much to say either, you know, because at the end I was raised in Mexico. I'm Mexican, my passport is Mexican, I'm Mexican, I cook Mexican food. I think that at the end your identity goes to those very basic things, you know, what you do for supper, and we have sopa de fideos for dinner, so I'm Mexican.
We're not producing any more Latinos.
Maybe on that note, I mean, you sort of started talking about what it means to be Mexican, at least in the United States. Maybe, Tomislav, can you take off your shirt? This was a joke, this was the sign for him to put something up. It's actually, can you guys see this?
No.
All right.
Can you bring it down a little bit? Those are made of glass, those things. This is like some graffiti, something someone did. But what is interesting is the rotoplas of their. Those are water cans that are in the ceilings of Mexican houses. So I can shout, I've been teaching all my life. So when you arrive in Mexico City, what you see is a sea of rotoplas things, because it's a city without water. I don't know, maybe this was taken in Chicago and I'm just ruining the whole show. But that would show my Mexican connection. You know? I don't care about the graffiti, what about the rotoplas. No? That means that these people doesn't get without water from time to time.
I thought this is actually, it was a bunch of international graffiti artists that had been brought to Mexico City to represent Mexico on the wall. And I saw a few of these and I picked this one and I thought you could comment on it. Maybe we could just stop on one of those and see if you could somewhat analyze it. No, I did not tell you about this. But I think it's quite, in some ways, self-evident if you can see the details. Are you able to?
Look closer.
You can come closer.
It's a flag, no?
It is a flag,
and the
yes.
green things are dollars.
Well, I don't see what the white thing. The red looks very much like blood spilled.
These are like soldiers, no? Toy soldiers.
Bones.
These ones are bones.
Yeah, the one in the middle, exactly. You win! It is cocaine. I mean, so it's dollars, cocaine, blood. And on one side is supposed to be the American soldiers, on the other side the Mexican soldiers. I'm not exactly sure which one is which. Maybe you guys can decide. But what does it say about Mexico, or what does it not say about Mexico?
Well, I mean, now that the audience has kindly interpreted the actual graffiti for us, I mean, I think it's quite self-evident. What has not been talked about enough in these 12 years of so-called drug war in Mexico is the way that the USA is deeply part and responsible for drug wars. It's American guns and it's American purchasing power that is buying the drugs that are produced in Mexico, mostly heroin, but also cocaine and marijuana, but now mostly heroin. And the blood spill, the bloodshed happens in Mexican territory. It doesn't cross the frontier. I think that, I mean, a lot is talked about now in terms of possibilities of legalization of drugs and that being possibly the only real solution to the problem of bloodshed through the drug wars. But I mean, I don't know if you want to say something else. It seems pretty, like, maybe too self-evident, what I'm saying, too obvious to you. I'm not sure.
Yeah, maybe just as general information. Your Croatian, the war on drugs began with the Senate. No, in 2006 there was a president, a Catholic conservative president, who won by a margin of less than 0.3% the elections. Which means that any mistake in the count
losing to the left-wing candidate.
Losing to the left-wing candidate that was a populist, and this was a Catholic conservative. And as a strategy to enforce his presidency, he ran as the president of education. That was his whole political career was based on education. And in the moment he arrived to the power with so little margin. And that means that most of the Mexicans didn't want him to be president. He made this very strange declaration. He was like a lawyer that looked like an accountant, a very short guy. And he showed up dressed up like a soldier, but the uniform didn't fit him well. So it was like it was a very ridiculous thing. And everybody laughed a lot about it when it happened. He appeared in TV declaring the war on the drugs, the drug wars, and everybody just laughed and kept going. But he actually did it, and it has cost 160,000 lives in Mexico.
Civilian lives.
Civilian lives, which is unbelievable. Mexico is a really big country. So Mexico has a population of 121 million. So even when the number is not representative in a nation like Mexico, that number of casualties is just enormous, brutal, and unknown in a country that was very peaceful during since the end of the revolution in 1921. Mexico was, I grew up in a country where the army was something that you saw on the day of the independence. Soldiers were not important. It was, you never saw a gun. And then the north of the country and the Gulf Coast of the country became like a war territory. And it's a war that really no one understands well. We're learning, we are understanding it. But it's basically a war between millionaires. Some millionaires on one side, some millionaires own the Pacific coast of Mexico, the other millionaires, those are the cartel of Sinaloa. And the cartel del Golfo, they own the Gulf Coast, and if you cross, they kill you. That's it. It was that simple. As the government declared war to them, the big drug bosses began to fall in jail or in battle, and those big cartels that control the territory and were business people, in fact, that deal with the Mexican and the American governments with no problem, disappeared, and little factions began to take over control, and now it's a big mess that no one knows how to resolve. So I suppose that's a representation of Mexico that has to do a lot with what the press shows of Mexico. I am a strong believer in the press showing these kind of things, but it's not everything that there is in Mexico.
No, can I just add something to that? To go back to the American component of this representation, and just to give you some idea of the hard facts, maybe you've probably all heard. It was over the news for months and months, and then it quieted down and disappeared, of the 43 students from Ayotzinapa that were is that the region where Ayotzinapa is, the Ayotzinapa, the college where these students study, is a region in which 93% of the poppy seed to produce heroin is cultivated. So it's the most important region from which heroin that travels to the United States is produced. So it is a particularly conflicted region. And it's, I think, very convenient for for the New York Times, so to speak, to say, to paint the Mexican panorama as one in which there is constant bloodshed and instability, and that there's no responsibility on the other side of the border. It's a picture of Mexico that has been drawn and redrawn since basically the 19th century, the wild South and the civilized North. And I think that it's important not only at a high level of conversation to think of the equation in its full components, but also to start introducing that into more sort of popular culture, graffiti, sort of street knowledge. Because until there isn't an acceptance of the full scale of it, there is no solution.
Because one last thing to save you the Lacanian analysis of this is really interesting that you show the picture. And when I say is, look, Rotoclas, Mexico City. We are completely used to that bloodshed in Mexico. At the end, I don't see the blood, I don't see the cocaine, I don't see the dollars. I can't imagine something more sexy than that mix, not blood, dollars, cocaine. What I see is the water tappers. No? This picture was taken in Mexico City, that the Psychoanalytic Society of Croatia paid for that.
I hope we have Croatian psychologists that will receive us after that. We'll need some therapy.
Of course, I was doing a bit of research before I was told to do this panel, and I was looking at some numbers because I thought, okay, you guys will provide the opinions and the analysis and your anecdotes and experiences, and I thought, okay, well, I'll provide some numbers, and apparently, in terms of the amount of money coming in from the United States to Mexico from the drug war, it's about 25 billion to 40 billion US dollars. And that's the biggest amount of share of all the money coming into Mexico. More than oil exports and more than remittances. That's money coming from people like you living abroad and then sending money back home. So it seems, and someone had said, drug money makes the Mexican economy go round. And so how is that possible when at the same time you have the Mexican president and other governments signing pacts with the United States saying we are going to win the war on drugs. It's contagious, this confusion.
It's really confusing.
So it seems very contradictory.
Well, I'm not sure about that number, but certainly the main industry of Mexico is migrant production. More, yes. The thing that tourism is big. Mexico is a big country. It's the seventh economy in the world. It's a really big country, and it's a rich country. Really, but the richness is that distributed, but it's a really rich country, and it's an industrial country to a very high degree. I think 70% of the population lives in urban areas. No? So most of the cars you drive, most of the TVs you watch, most of the planes you fly are made in Mexico. And yes, well, in different zones. All this began in the 70s as maquiladoras, but now there is production. Half of the planes of the world are designed and done in Querétaro, in Mexico, for example. So it's a big industrial power. Even considering that tremendous amount of money that comes every day into Mexico for this industry, the first source of money for Mexico is the migrant families that are working in the US and send these billions and billions of dollars
15 million.
We did homework. 15 million persons. No, I don't know. No one really knows how much of the money that moves in the US and in Mexico comes from the drug. There are all these calculus that suppose that if the drug money was subtracted from the Mexican and American economy, we would become like a small country in the Caribbean, the two countries. But it's all speculation. No one really knows. And I think that to not have hard data is a hard data. That is a hidden data. I suppose that the Mexican government and the American government know exactly how much money is moved through the drugs because in both countries it's moved through the police force. So that business cannot be done only illegal.
But it's money that doesn't come back into the population and is distributed in any sort of way. You were saying earlier, and it's true, when before the drug war exploded, and there were just a few major capos, very much in the Colombian model, these capos would make sure that the town hall looked pretty, and that the church always had renovation processes, to just give an example. But as soon as that disintegrated into a lot of different little blocks without a head, it all became a huge mess, and that the money is basically black money that is not reintegrated into the economy in any way. If drugs were legal and a tax could be charged from buying and selling, then perhaps our economies would be much better, in fact.
Sorry, the useful life of a drug law is reduced to 3 or 4 years now. What is interesting is, in any case, the mental equation. You are an 18-year-old, and at 23 you can be a lot of drug. You can move a lot of money and have a lot of like boys and girls and men, or whatever you want to have. But in 5 years you will be or in prison or dead. Because it's not that the Mexican justice system works at all, but somehow justice is done, not usually on the hard way. And people keep betting for that kind of life. That the only solution, as Valeria said, is legalization. But I think, but this is a step that no one wants to take, and maybe no one will ever take.
In our lifetime.
It has a very easy solution. Tax it. Just legalize it and tax it.
I was hearing a program where one, I guess you could call him a politician, he was saying, well, that wouldn't be, even if you legalize the drugs, the cartels still have a lot of money and resources in terms of trafficking, human smuggling, prostitution. So even if you took out the drugs and legalized it just in Mexico, it still wouldn't be illegal. I mean, it still would be illegal in the US, so that wouldn't really get to do.
Maybe we'll push the conflict up. Of course.
No, it's something that everybody has. It's something that everybody has to do. And I think that as a citizen of Croatia, what you must think is the next time you do coke in a party, you are doing blood. You are doing Mexican blood. We are putting the people, and these people, these kids from schools that have a future, they could go to a public university and have a career and belong to a big middle class, but they took the decision of living fast and gloriously. And I totally understand the glamour of that thing if you are an 18-year-old with a more or less uncertain future. So it's their blood that you are having.
It's kind of radical.
Sorry.
I don't necessarily agree that it is.
I was wondering if you could talk, since there is the American dollar on the flag, about NAFTA. Do you want to just introduce a little bit about it? I think it's
What NAFTA is?
what NAFTA is and the effects, because it was. So maybe I'll let you go and then I'll chip in.
I mean, maybe I can. I don't know if I'm speaking to people that already know all of this and this is extremely boring, like NAFTA agreements, or if it's new information to you. I don't know.
Are you guys bored?
No. This is new to you.
As president, because we are discussing the TTIP agreement now and NAFTA,
is one of the biggest, the seventh economy in the world. It's geographically speaking North America, although most people tend to place it in South America, but it's North America. But culturally and linguistically, it's Latin America. In the 90s and 94, the USA, Mexico, and Canada signed a free trade agreement, the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, in which basically there would be free trade of products, cheap manual labor produced things in Mexico that could then pass the frontiers without the typical frontier tariffs, taxes, etc. And of course, the borders to Mexico were open for the more manufactured version of those products. We usually would export cheap sort of raw material or parts of things, and they're manufactured in a sense, and that's just part of it. But I was born in the 80s. Already in the 80s, there was a certain presence in the USA, in Mexico, of course, in everyday culture, so to speak. But the free trade agreements in '94 really opened the dam of influx of American products. And Alvaro sometimes says that he still in his Mexico, things like toothpaste were not easily available. I wasn't born in that Mexico, but in my lifetime I did certainly see a huge change from a more provincial Mexico, a Mexico that felt, especially Mexico City, that felt more disconnected from the world, to one that felt as one that was deeply part of the globalized circuit of metropolis. However, as always, in these kind of trade agreements, the terms of trade are unequal. And one of the things that, for example, is not part of the trade agreement is free movement of people. So, of course, Mexican people, you can export anything, but people are not allowed to cross the border without a certain kind of visa or a certain kind of permit. And just in terms, for example, of deportation law, which is something that I work with a lot in my everyday, I work as an interpreter in immigration courts. One of the I guess most unjust laws passed recently in 2008 by George Bush was that the USA can accept asylum seekers or refugees, child refugees, for example, any country except from countries that share a border. It's a way of making a law so that Mexicans don't go, obviously, Canadian children are not going to try to live in Mexico. And Mexican children do. So, I mean, NAFTA has to be read in those terms, no? in terms of unequal exchanges, basically.
Then all systems tend to equilibrium. So as the great problem with NAFTA, I think, was that, that there was no, I don't know, the European community has some systems to equalize the level of life of the population of the countries that are admitted. There is a certain amount of inversion that permits a country with a smaller economy to have a better infrastructure to be able to compete inside the European community. Mexico, NAFTA doesn't have those provisions. No, it's like a pact between three pirates. No, we take everything, we sell everything. We don't care for human rights. We don't care for environmental issues. We don't care for it. It's just about money and production. Anyway, those 15 million Mexicans that went illegally in these later years to the United States and that are sending all that money back to Mexico are somehow the equalizing system that finds its own way. No, I insist that systems tend to equality, and there is this like forced inversion of American money that goes through this beautiful and process that is a guy that works in a drugstore and gets a little bit of money and sends it to Mexico. No? The next guy that works in the kitchen does the same thing, and at the end, the American economy is somehow doing what the provisions of the International Pact do.
Yeah, that's also a way of romanticizing the right? Because the conditions in which these 15 million Mexicans, not all of them people, by the way, work are horrendous. No? They live in hiding. They work only in kitchens and like in New York, it's almost there's a creepy aspect to it. No? I don't know if you've been to New York. There's along the sidewalks, there's these metal contraptions, like doors that open from the ground up. Not doors that are vertical, but like horizontal doors that open upwards like this. And those are all, they will have stairs that lead down to provision rooms or sometimes kitchens of restaurants. And our daughter, who's 5, used to ask us when she was 3 or so, like, who lives there? Witches? Are they? And until we had the heart to tell her, no, it's Mexicans down there. So it's like an underground, invisible city, or the spaces that the Mexicans occupy in New York is one reduced to visibility. If you were to map out those spaces, that would be the main one. Another one would be the centimeters between the sandwich counters and the wall, where they sell you a deli sandwich. Or the space that I particularly like that Mexicans occupy, the more space of freedom, or the space where I think that Mexican migrants get their revenge is the lane occupied by bicycles. You will see all these like well-trained Americans riding their bicycles with all their gadgets and latex and gears and lights and things and whatever, and riding really quickly. If we were riding, it's always like we get pushed out with phrases like, "One lane, move out, to your right," because they're these sportsmen doing their cycling. But then there's the Mexican distributors of food who ride their bikes using the chains that you use to lock your bike. They wear them around their chest, almost like Zapata. You remember Zapata with his double cartridge belt. They wear their chains like that, and are definitely the fastest of the city. No American cyclist can aspire to go faster than a Mexican trying to deliver something.
It was interesting to me to see some of the contradictions. Apparently NAFTA was saying, well, free trade will be good, and it will also help to limit immigration from Mexico to the United States, because the living conditions in Mexico will become better. And actually, it turns out that of the 15 million that you were talking about 60% of that went after NAFTA. So just the exact opposite happened. And one of the examples, and I don't know if you guys can comment on it, was in the agricultural sector. Because there's so many high subsidies in the United States for corn, for example, the farmers in Mexico could no longer compete and could no longer sell their corn, so they became, they had to became poor or had to change what they would make of their livelihoods. Is there anything that you have seen, or how has that affected Mexico?
Well, it produces an industrial economy that in the bigger picture is safer for the population, and not for the environment, of course. But I don't know. I grew up in a country that lived on corn and oil, and it wasn't a stable country. It was not easy. The dollar will. The peso would devaluate every week. There was never money. The industrial goods produce certain safety to the population, and in that sense, maybe only in that sense, but it's an important sense. I think that is not bad, but what is going on in the South American economies right now, that live mainly on soy and oil, is a catastrophe. That kind of a catastrophe it's not that I am a promoter. No? I just think that there are bigger currents in history, that the newspapers tell the minute story that is not the real story. I was telling, I don't know if in a forum, and I'm repeating myself, or in a coffee with friends not long ago, that there is this moment in the 19th century in which Hegel declares that Latin America must belong to the United States. That is, frankly, a stupidity to pretend not to belong to the United States, and it would be an historical mistake. And from there on, there was this terror, this panic of the Americans owning Latin America and Spanish getting extinguished. No? And if you see all the science fiction from the 20s when it began in Latin America to very recently, in all the science fiction, the Mexicans and the Argentinians and the Cubans would be speaking English. And what is going on is that the Americans are speaking Spanish. So I think that
everywhere except in the New York Times.
Everywhere except in the New Yorker and the New York Times, everybody speaks Spanish. There is now the Latin Americans are the first majority of the United States. So you can. The idea of border is something that was invented during the French Revolution to fuck up people. And it's not that easy to fuck up people. No, people just, borders are porous. No? The Mexicans are returning to their historical territories, and there is like a genetic moving there. So there are urgent human rights issues. You know, there are urgent civil rights issues with migration. But the big picture, I think that now is less dramatic than as it looked when I was a kid, you know, in the 80s, the Cold War. The prophecies in those times were tremendous. Now we're worried about if the kids that went to public schools in the US should receive big scholarships or little scholarships if they study in the US. That's a first world problem already.
Can I just ask something, like, as an anecdote that is kind of illustrative of this fear of soft power invasion of the English language and of the United States into Mexico? I think that was at its highest in the late 1920s when Hollywood was already a big industry and was, for the first time in 1928 or 29, starting to produce sound film. And so the first sound films came in English to a population that didn't speak English, and that not only didn't speak English, but had a great suspicion of the English language. If you were an educated Latin American, so quite late, what you spoke was French, and English was the language of the barbarians to the north. And so these first films in English were, by presidential decree, banned, or the English of it was banned. So for a while I just had films that were now not silenced, so that you did not hear the English of it. Then they tried, of course, subtitling, but most of the population in the 20s, not most, but a very high percentage of the population was illiterate. So dubbing, not dubbing, but subtitling was absurd. And then they tried dubbing, but people complained that the dubbers who were now who were already in Hollywood living, that were Latin Americans from very different parts, so there were a series of accents, and that felt like a contamination and a not truthful rendering of the movie. And then what they did in Hollywood, because they saw that there was a big market in the Latin American territory, was to hire actors and actresses that spoke Spanish, mostly from Spain, to kind of physically, in their entire bodies, dub the original actor. So they would re-act an entire movie with these sort of versions of the originals. And these versions spoke Spanish. So then for a long time, the movies that you saw were in Spanish, but they were acted not by the originals, but by full-body dubbers. None of that passed on. Eventually, Mexico, much later, just simply allowed like heavy influx of Hollywood and stop dubbing. The only things that are dubbed in Mexico, I think, are the child movies, but not films.
Maybe you could talk a little bit about, since you went back to Hollywood and again the relationship between the United States and Mexico. Alvaro, you talked about a porous border. At the same time, it seems like the amount of people trying to cross the border northward, there are more and more casualties because, for example, I was looking at what does that border look like. Have you been to that border? What does it? Maybe you could give a portrait of what it looks like.
It's a wall.
Can you look for a picture in Google? I mean, in Tijuana, it's horrible. When you land in Tijuana airport, there's a long wall when you drive into the city. I was there a long time ago, and on the Mexican side of the wall, people have planted and regularly go in and bring a new one, as if it was like a flower. They plant across when they've lost someone trying to cross the border. So it's kilometers and kilometers of white crosses of dead people next to a wall.
There is one graffiti in the Tijuana wall that is beautiful that says, "Si el muro de Berlín cayó, ¿por qué el de Tijuana no?" You know, if the Berlin Wall fell, why this one not? You know? I think that is mainly an intimidatory, humiliating strategy of the American government that sadly enough is not dedicated to the Mexicans, but to the Americans. No, I think that wall and those is the spectacle of the right wing of the United States showing their own citizens that they are doing something. No? Because the truth is that Mexican migration to the U.S. stopped long ago, 5 or 6 years ago. There are, in the later years, there are more Americans migrating to Mexico than Mexicans migrating to the United States. But that happened because of the economical cycles of Mexico, and mainly because the moving people from one side of the other to the border became a business of the drug dealers, so the Mexicans would simply stop doing it because it was too dangerous. You know, you are in hands of psychopaths, you know, so you just don't do it. But those walls don't stop the people. Mexicans stop migrating to the United States, but the Central Americans keep crossing that wall. I don't know how. There are tunnels there, but I insist borders are porous.
It was interesting in looking at again at different articles or documentaries, and they were making the link between the different declarations of war. You talked about the war on drugs. Officially, I think the war on drugs in the U.S. was declared in 1989.
No, it was before. It was Nixon.
Well, I think I read that it was officially. Maybe they used that term.
Yes, the invention of the term is Nixon.
And then it seems like, right around the time of NAFTA in '94 is when there was more initiatives to try to fight immigration. So right as there was this opening of borders on the economical and political level, there was also very much a closing of borders, as you have referred to. But apparently in 2005, so under Bush Jr., there was, right around when the war on terror was yet another war, there was also an initiative called Secure Border Initiative, which basically pumped in a lot more money into the borders. And I was looking again, sometimes the numbers, of course numbers lie all the time, but approximately of the 20,000 agents that are sent to protect the borders of the United States, 92% of that is along Mexico. The 8 is for Canada, which has, which is a border that's more than twice the length of that of Mexico. So it's interesting to me this sort of create the linking of drugs, terrorism, and immigration. Illegal immigration, or as some people prefer to call it, undocumented immigration. And so it's as if the Cold War in a way hadn't ended, it just the terms are different. So I'd like to actually respond back to you, Alvaro, because you sort of said, it's still better than when I was growing up. And yet, I don't know, maybe this is a bit of an exaggeration or not.
No. The world is never better. The world is always worse. No, I'm just trying to look at things to put some distance to the problem, to live. People must know that here. To live in a country at war is simply overwhelming. No, you have to find ways to tell yourself the story. More if you are a professional liar, that is my case. You know? So I just try to tell myself to see the big picture, to make it real, you know? to stop looking, to be able to see the working class. No? I have that right to. We have the right to happiness. We have the right to newspapers, but we have the right to happiness. We have that. I don't think that we should be so obsessed. As the Clash say, I'm so bored of the USA. I'm really bored. Why are we talking about the United States in a table about Mexico? No, it's not that important.
Can you separate them?
I can, yes. Yes,
so is it something that in a way, I mean, you almost make it sound like it's a myth that you're creating just to make it bearable.
No, but I think I think what he's getting at, and I think I also want to get there, is that, of course, you cannot see the picture of Mexico and with respect to the drug war in particular without the component of the US or the topic of migration without that. But not all should be eclipsed by a drug war, our 12-year drug war. Not all can be. I mean, it's definitely like the buzz at the back and sometimes at the forefront of our minds every single day as Mexicans. But there are a lot of other things, and not necessarily positive things. The war on drugs has also eclipsed other very urgent problems like illiteracy or hunger and poverty. And all of that, of course, is interrelated, but it's not even being combated. It's not even being addressed as a problem because there is an obsession inside Mexico and worldwide to only project an image of Mexico in terms of the recent drug war. And what is also kind of pushed out of the way, and it's happening to us now here as we speak, and to us as Mexican writers many times when we speak in tables, that the only thing that can be talked about is the drug war. And it's not the only thing there is, but it is definitely the most attractive narrative. Nothing beats an account of drug war. Blood, cocaine, and dog. It's a thriller there for you every day in the newspaper, every day in every conversation. But I think that, and as writers, I do think that, as a writer, I definitely don't want to speak for Alvaro in this kind of statement. As a writer, I do feel the obligation to definitely not look away, definitely address, use certain spaces in the media to speak about it. But also, in my work, I feel an obligation to continue thinking about other things, or to address the problem of violence in more subtle ways, to rephrase things in a language that's not the language of the media. So yeah, let's talk about something else.
After you make a table with two American writers, and you force them to speak about Mexico during the whole hour. No, Mexico is much more than its border. No? It's a much more interesting country. And the fact that the later cultural production of Mexico moves in the bloody vehicle of drugs doesn't make it the only vehicle. No, it's not the only subject.
No, for sure. But everything is, as you were saying, is very much interconnected. As you were talking about the 43 students and how the fact that poppy seed production or cultivation is really high in that area.
Yeah.
But maybe you could talk a little bit more. I think there were two things that were very interesting about that story. There was a positive side to it that we had started to talk about, and maybe you could elaborate on that a little bit more in terms of who were those students and why did people care or not care, depending on how much it was covered in the media. And the other thing is, especially in terms of coverage of the media, how how much can all of the facets of Mexico be covered in the media? Mexico is one of the worst countries in the world to be a journalist.
maybe some more background on the case of Ayotzinapa. The students that were lifted, as they say, euphemistically, lifted is the word, in Spanish the word they use is levantar, which means to pick up or lift, and that's the euphemistic term that they use in media to say that people were killed, abducted, disappeared, are sequestered and not to be found. These 43 students were studying in a radical left institution that has been important and going on for many, many years. An institution that has created a lot of local leaders that have tried to produce a counterbalance local politics. This is the school in Ayotzinapa. And they were freshmen, like they were in their first and second, most of them in the first and some in their second year of college. And they were asked to take some buses to block a highway in order to raise money by blocking the highway for their acts. And they were going to go to a big demonstration in Mexico City that happens every October, in protest of the killing of students in 1968 in Mexico City in the Plaza Tlatelolco. And so the orders for their killing were given by the mayor, I guess that's the word in English, of Daxon Guerrero and of Iguala, and the 43 of them were disappeared. The reaction, we've been hearing about levantones and disappearances for 12 years now, and it's been a gradual and increasing gradual process. And the reaction in these 12 years from civil society in Mexico has never been very strong. There were a few demonstrations in Mexico City when, for example, the son of a well-known Mexican poet was killed in Cuernavaca, lifted as well. The middle class somehow empathized because it was a member of the middle class who now had been abducted and organized themselves and did a few demonstrations. And a few important things came out of that, but that died down rather quickly. With Ayotzinapa, what happened was that for the first time in 12 years, Mexican civil society seems to have decided to do something, to get organized, to form citizen groups, to engage in long-standing demonstrations, to seek out international, not intervention, but presence, to raise the awareness internationally more thoroughly. And, I mean, there are some more symbolic, less important, perhaps things that are not important, are not less important if you are, as probably all of you are, interested in language and literature as such. And one of the things that I was moved by the most was a group of international translators that have a journal called Asymptote. Asymptote has I think, I don't know, 50, 80 different territories in which they have a base and they have a local editor. And they put together a translation of a poem titled Ayotzinapa, and a poem about violence. And I really appreciated and tried to collaborate as much as I could with putting that into circulation, because I thought, well, the word Ayotzinapa was a word foreign not only to everyone in the world, but to most Mexicans. It was not something that, it wasn't a word that circulated, or that it wasn't a place that we knew of as Mexicans. And the putting into circulation of this word, and not only in Spanish, but in many different languages, was a way of creating a focal point of attention and of not allowing what was happening in Mexico to become a kind of foreign and therefore alien problem to the rest of the people. By bringing attention to the word and making it circulate among people, I think there was at least a sense of bringing something closer, unforeignizing, so to speak, something that seemed a completely alien reality. That was just one of the many things. But many things did spring out of all of this. I don't know if you want to mention others. But one of the things that was not so good was the Human Rights Watch, for example. And we had a lot of conversations with people from Human Rights Watch in New York, in which we asked, well, how possible would it be to ask for a commission of truth and justice to come in and really do something. And what the response was, and these were incredibly nice people. It wasn't they weren't being cynical. They were just, I guess, being realistic. The response was, well, this is not. There haven't been enough deaths. There's not enough atrocity to bring in or to create one such commission. And Human Rights Watch would need to wait and see for there to be, I guess, more bloodshed, so that a commission can come in and actually start putting real international pressure.
So there was a lot of positive things coming out of a rather tragic moment that often would be covered by the media and forgotten.
I hope that some political change comes through there. But I've been wondering since Roman wrote to me 6 months ago, maybe to begin to discuss this table, and this is why Mexico matters. Why this cause Mexico is Zagreb? Why this is important? Why freedom of expression in Mexico matters? No, why the bloodshed, the Mexican bloodshed, should be important for the world. It's not that I have an answer of really, but there is this, there are like symptoms that worry more than like a moment in which a group of criminals think that they can just erase from the air the poison for 8 students and nothing will happen. But that says a lot. The same thing with the journalists. There have been 80 killings of journalists in the last decade. The 81, there was one that was just filed last month, so there is 81 killed journalists, and still 17 disappeared. That's worse than Iraq. Mexico is a country where it's more dangerous to be a journalist. Now, why is it important to say that here? Why that should be known, and here I am not completely sure. I think that just Mexico must not be left alone. I think that the fact that Mexico keeps being a liberal democracy is important. The possibility of Mexico becoming a lefty liberal democracy is important. I insist, the goods we consume, the hands that make these things are Mexican. Those hands should be protected by the international community. Now, back to, no, I will leave it. I will leave it there. But the question is that one, why that? And I think that as long as we stay just in the journalistic information, we will not be able to know why Mexico matters. You see, I've been for 12 years now, maybe 15 years, reading all this literature, journalistic and literary, about the drug war in Mexico. It's all about the red note of the day, about decapitations, about cocaine passing from one country to another. I've been in 1,000 tables, and they are all alike. Maybe we should begin to exercise our power to define what is Mexico instead of what happened yesterday in Mexico. Why it matters, why those 5,000 years of culture matters. Why the fact that Mexico City has been for 700 years a capital, first of a kingdom, then of an empire, then of another kingdom, then of a colony, then it was, we were discussing today, if it was a capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire or the French Empire, then an American colony, then the capital of a republic, and the city resists. There have been these incredible efforts to make Mexico City an incredibly rich city, incredibly old, so there, everybody that has had power in the world has tried to fuck Mexico City, and they can't. We just see them pass. So why this matters? Why we should conserve this? Why Should we just do what Hegel does? No? Yes, just go to the United States, let the FBI do the job, and keep going. No? Why we resist? No? I think that we should resist. I will die resisting. No? But why? No, that's the question. That's why I think that we must speak about it.
I think we should maybe end on "I will die resisting." I think that's a perfect ending. Unfortunately, the time has run out, but let's please give a warm applause for.